The dark had a weight to it before the stove was lit, a cold so complete that Margareta Reinke woke inside it rather than into it, as though she had been sleeping at the bottom of a well. She lay a moment beneath the quilts, listening. The wind was doing what it always did this time of year, running low along the eaves with a sound like someone dragging a broom across a floor, steady, unhurried, not unkind. Beside her, Johann was already stirring, the ropes of the bedstead creaking under his weight as he swung his feet to the floor and drew in a breath through his teeth at the touch of the boards. "Kalt," he said, which was not a complaint so much as a fact being confirmed, the way a man might read a thermometer, aloud to no one. She rose after him, pulling her shawl from the bedpost and wrapping it over her nightgown before her feet found the floor. The house held its cold in the corners longest, in the seams around the two small windows where the frost grew in the night like something planted. Fern shapes and feathered whorls thickened over the glass so that no light came through them yet, only a paleness that told her dawn was still an hour off, maybe more. She had learned to read that paleness the way she had once read a clock face in Hanover, in the kitchen of her mother's house, though that house and that clock were a lifetime and an ocean behind her now, and this was the only clock she kept any more. The gray at the window, the particular hush of the hour before the roosters found their voices. Johann was already at the stove, kneeling before it with the poker in hand, stirring the banked coals to see what remained of last night's fire. A thread of orange showed beneath the gray ash, faint as a candle behind a curtain, and he fed it first with a twist of hay, then a broken corn cob, watching until the flame caught and held before he added a stick of the split cottonwood they kept by the box. The smell came up right away, that dry Swedish smoke of corncob burning, mixed under it the mineral smell of the cast iron warming, and Margaret felt her shoulders loosen at it the way they did every morning, some old animal part of her recognizing that warmth was coming even before her hands did. "I'll see to the cow," Johann said, already reaching for his coat where it hung stiff and cold on its peg by the door, the wool holding the shape of his shoulders, even empty. He pulled his cap down over his ears, wound the muffler Margaret had knit him 2 winters back twice around his throat, and stepped into his boots, which had been standing by the stove all night and were still only a little warmer than the floor. The door opened on a gust that pushed straight through the room, carrying with it the smell of snow and the flat, cold smell of the yard, and then it shut again, and he was gone into the dark, his lantern swinging a small yellow circle ahead of him toward the barn. She set the coffee pot on the stove's front lid, where the iron was beginning to tick and hum with heat, and by lamplight, the kerosene lamp on the table throwing a low, steady glow that did not reach the corners of the room, she began on the morning's bread. Flour, a spoon of the saleratus, a pinch of salt, water from the covered pail by the stove, which had not frozen overnight because it sat close enough to the iron's warmth, though the barrel outside would want breaking again this morning, same as every morning. Her hands remembered the proportions without her needing to think of them, kneading the dough on the board with the heel of her palm, the flour dust rising pale in the lamplight and settling again on the dark wood of the table, on her forearms, on the flowered apron she had sewn from a bolt bought 3 summers back at the dry goods in town. Upstairs, if it could be called upstairs, for it was only the low loft under the slope of the roof, reached by a ladder nailed fast to the wall, she heard the children beginning to stir. Wilhelm first, always Wilhelm first, 13 now, and taking it as a matter of pride that he rose without being called. She heard his feet on the loft boards, then on the ladder rungs, then his shape coming down into the lamplight in his long underclothes, with his trousers already half pulled on, hopping on one foot to work the other leg through. "Morgen, Mutter," he said, his voice still thick with sleep, and went straight for the stove to warm his hands before he'd so much as combed his hair with his fingers. "Morgen, get your boots by the fire. They'll be like ice else." Behind him came Liesel, 10 years old, moving more slowly, wrapping the quilt from her own narrow cot around her shoulders like a cloak and trailing it down the ladder rungs after her, which earned her a mild word from her mother about catching it and falling, a word Liesel had heard every winter morning of her life and no longer troubled to answer beyond a nod. And behind her, last and slowest, came little Franz, not yet 6, who did not so much climb down the ladder as arrive at the bottom of it by some process of controlled falling into his brother's arms, still mostly asleep, his cheek pressed to Wilhelm's shoulder, one thumb near his mouth, though he had mostly broken the habit of sucking it outright. The room filled slowly with the smell of the bread now shaped into its pan and set near the stove to rise a second time, and under that the coffee beginning to give off its dark, bitter smell, and under that still the tallow and wick smell of the lamp, burning low and faithful on the table. Margaret set Franz on the bench nearest the stove, wrapped him in the second quilt kept there for exactly this purpose, and went back to her dough, while Liesel, more awake now, took up the task of laying the table, the tin plates, the mismatched forks, the jar of sorghum molasses they were using sparingly this winter, meaning to make it last past the thaw. Outside, faint through the walls, came the particular sound of Johann's boots crossing frozen ground, the creak and complaint of the barn door on its leather hinge, and then, muffled by 2 walls in the wind, the low answering complaint of the cow, unbothered, merely making conversation the way she always did when a lantern came toward her in the dark. Margaret could follow the whole shape of it without seeing it. Johann setting the lantern on its nail, forking down hay from the loft above the stalls, the horses shifting and blowing in their stanchions, the particular ring of the milk pail being set on the frozen dirt floor. She banked more wood into the stove and set the skillet on to heat, salt pork already sliced thin and waiting on a plate covered with a cloth. The frost on the windows had begun just barely to take on the first gray cast of the coming light, though sunrise itself was still the better part of an hour off. This was always the strangest part of the day to her, this suspended hour when the family moved about the one warm room of the house, while the whole rest of the world outside, the yard, the fields under their crust of old snow, the road that ran a mile off toward the section line, the country beyond that, all the way to wherever her mother's kitchen in Hanover still stood, if it stood at all, lay entirely dark and entirely still, as though the Reinke claim were the only lit place left on the earth. Wilhelm had his boots on now and was pulling his coat from its peg, preparing to follow his father out, for the chores were more than one man could see to quickly on a morning this cold, and a boy of 13 was reckoned old enough now to carry his share. He took up the second lantern, checked that there was oil enough in its well, and paused at the door only long enough to say, "The chickens will want their water broken too, I expect," which was less a question than a boy reminding himself of his own list. And then he was out, the door cracking open on the dark and the and shutting again just as fast, leaving the room to feel for a moment even warmer than before by contrast. Franz had fallen back half asleep against the quilt, and Liesel had taken up the wooden spoon to stir the cornmeal mush now beginning to thicken in its pot, her small face serious with the responsibility of it, the spoon scraping in slow circles against the bottom so nothing would catch and scorch. Margaret watched her a moment, the girl's hair still in its night braid, coming loose at the crown, her nightgown showing beneath the hem of the wrapper she'd pulled on over it, and felt the particular tenderness that came to her most mornings at this hour, before the day had properly begun to ask anything of anyone, when the children were still soft with sleep, and the room still smelled of bread rising, and coffee starting, and the good clean smoke of a fire freshly caught. The bread pan she set into the oven box, built into the side of the stove, judging the heat the way she always did, by holding her hand near the iron door and counting the seconds she could bear it. Outside the window, the frost ferns were beginning ever so slightly to glow, the gray going faintly to silver, though the sun itself was still below the flat rim of the land to the east. Somewhere out past the low shape of the barn, a rooster tried its voice, found it wanting, and tried again, and this time another answered it, and Margaret knew without looking that the true morning, the milking finished, the eggs gathered, the water broken and hauled, was not far off now, and that soon enough the whole small house would be awake and moving and full, the way it was every morning of this life she had chosen or been given or simply grown into, out here on the wide cold plain under a sky that was, even now, just beginning to show the first thin edge of light along the eastern dark. In the barn the cold had a different quality than in the yard, closer and thicker, held in by the sod walls the way a held breath is held, and Johann was glad of it even so, for a soddy barn kept its warmth better than any board structure could, banked as it was on three sides by the earth itself. The lantern threw its light up along the low rafters, catching the chaff dust that hung always in the air of a barn in winter, drifting slow as a snow that never fell. The cow, Bertha, stood patient in her stall, her breath rising in soft clouds, and she turned her head toward the lantern and gave her low, complaining call, more greeting than complaint really, the sound she made every morning of her life to tell him she had noticed his arrival and approved of it, provided he did not delay overlong with the hay. He forked hay down to her first, and to the two horses in their stalls beyond, Prince and the mare they called simply Fanny, both of them stamping and blowing steam into the cold, glad of the grain he measured after the hay, a small ration, for grain was dear, and the horses would not be worked hard again until spring plowing only kept fit and fed through the idle months. Wilhelm came in behind him with the second lantern and set to breaking the ice that had formed overnight on the water trough, using the wooden mallet kept for the purpose, striking it in 3 sharp blows until the skin of ice gave way and dark water showed beneath, the horses already crowding forward for it before the boy had stepped clear. "Careful of the edge," Johann said, though the boy had done this chore 100 mornings now and needed the warning less each year, and Wilhelm only grunted in the particular way of a boy who has heard a caution too many times to answer it in words. Johann took the milking stool from its nail and set it beside Bertha's flank, the pail between his knees, and leaned his head against the warm curve of her side the way he always did, more from habit than from need of the warmth, though the warmth was welcome too. The milk came in its steady rhythm, that sound he had heard every morning for going on 12 years now since first he and Margaret had broken this ground. A sound so familiar he no longer heard it as sound at all, but as something closer to silence, the hiss and ring of it against the tin, the pail filling by degrees, the smell of warm milk and hay, and the animal's own good clean smell rising together in the cold barn air. Bertha shifted her weight once, twice, and stood otherwise still, chewing her cud in the dark, entirely unbothered by the season or the hour or anything at all beyond the next mouthful of hay. When the pail was near full, he set it aside, covered with a cloth against the chaff dust, and went to see to the pigs in their pen, built against the barn's leeward wall, 2 hogs being fattened yet for the winter's meat, grunting and shuffling at his approach, glad of the corn he threw down for them, for the frozen slops he broke loose from the trough with the flat of a shovel. The chickens he left to Wilhelm, who had already gone to the coop, a low sod-roofed structure built onto the barn's south side to catch what little winter sun there was, and Johann could hear him in there now, talking low to the hens the way he always did, coaxing them off their roosts, breaking the crust of ice on their water dish, running his hand along the straw of the nest boxes for the few eggs the hens saw fit to give this time of year, when the days were short and the cold made them reluctant layers. 4, Wilhelm called out, meaning eggs, and Johann said nothing back, only nodded to himself in the dark, for 4 in this cold was a fair number and nothing to complain of. He stood a moment in the barn doorway with the full pail in hand, looking east where the sky had gone from black to a deep, close gray. No color in it yet, only the suggestion that color was still possible, that the sun had not forgotten the arrangement it kept with this particular quarter section of Nebraska ground. The wind came steady across the yard, carrying the smell of the straw stack, and fainter under that, the smell of wood smoke rising thin and gray from the house chimney 100 yards off. The one bright certain thing in all that gray dawn, the promise of the stove and the coffee, and his wife's face turned toward the door when he came in. The water barrel by the house had frozen its usual skin overnight despite standing close under the eave, and he broke it now with the heel of his boot before dipping the bucket through, the ice cracking in long jagged plates that he kicked aside toward the drift already piled along the foundation. His hands had gone numb some minutes back, the particular numbness that was not quite pain and not quite nothing, that would ache pleasantly once the stove's heat found them again. He carried the milk pail in one hand and the water bucket in the other, Wilhelm coming behind him with the basket of 4 eggs held carefully against his chest, and Franz's face appeared for a moment at the window, small and round and pressed close to the glass, watching for them the way he watched every morning, as though their return from the barn were each day a small event worth witnessing. Inside, the warmth struck Johann's face like something almost solid, and he stood a moment just inside the door, letting it work into him. The smell of the mush and the coffee, and the good yeast smell of the bread, now baking thick in the room, before he set the pail on the sideboard and began working the stiffness from his fingers by rubbing them together over the stove's warmth. Margaret strained the fresh milk through the cloth into the crockery jug, setting aside a portion in the small pitcher for the table and carrying the rest down the 2 steps to the cellar door, where it would keep sweet in the cold earth a day or 2 before it wanted churning. The root cellar breathed its own particular air up at her whenever she opened that door, a smell of damp earth and old apples and the sharper smell of the kraut crock in the corner, mixed with the dusty smell of potatoes and turnips banked in their bins of sand, put up back in October when the whole family had spent the better part of a week at the digging and the storing, Johann and Wilhelm with the fork and spade, she and Liesel sorting the good roots from the bruised, Franz mostly underfoot and delighted by it. She could see in the lantern's edge of light the rows of jars she had put up too, tomatoes and beans, and the dried apple slices strung on thread and hung to cure back in September, now filling 3 burlap sacks against the wall, waiting to be stewed into the pies Franz asked after nearly every week of the cold months. She came back up with a jar of the canned tomatoes for the evening's beans, set it on the sideboard, and returned to the stove, where the mush wanted stirring again, and the coffee had begun, at last, its low, steady perk against the lid. Johann had taken the bench nearest the fire, Franz climbing at once into his lap despite being told twice already that his father's coat was still cold from the barn, and the boy pressed his face contentedly against the wool anyway, unbothered by the chill of it, only glad of his father's return. Cold enough this morning to freeze the words in a man's mouth, Johann said, working his fingers now closer to the stove's heat, and Margaret answered only with a small sound of agreement, for this was a thing he said most mornings of the winter, and she had long since stopped needing to answer it as though it were new information, only as though it were a kind of morning greeting between them, said in place of anything more elaborate, the plain shorthand of 2 people who had said most of what needed saying to each other over 12 years, and found they could rest easy now in the smaller, quieter exchanges. The light at the window had gone properly gray now, edging toward something that might, in another half hour, be called morning in earnest, and the frost ferns on the glass had begun to show their pattern more clearly, each one distinct, branching and re-branching the way frost always did, a different pattern every morning, though Margaret could never have said what made one morning's ice different from the last. She set the mush pot off the direct heat to keep warm, cracked 2 of the fresh eggs into the skillet where the salt pork had rendered its fat, and called Liesel to fetch Franz down from his father's lap and set him at his place at table for breakfast at last, in this house that smelled now entirely of bread and coffee and wood smoke, and the good simple food of a plains morning was very nearly ready. They ate at the plank table Johann had built their second summer on the claim, the wood gone smooth and pale under years of scrubbing, Franz on the bench between his mother and Liesel where he could be watched, Wilhelm at his father's right hand in the place that had become his without anyone deciding it, simply by virtue of being the eldest and the one who rose earliest. The mush went round with milk still warm from the barn, and a spoon of sorghum for each bowl. The eggs and salt pork divided evenly. The bread, not the new loaf, which wanted another hour yet to cool, but yesterday's, sliced thick and spread with butter. Margaret had churned 2 days back, passed hand to hand along with the coffee, weak enough for the children to have a little of it milked and sweetened, strong for Johann, who drank his black and scalding and said, as he always did after the first swallow, that it was the one thing in the world that could put a man right after a morning like this one. Franz ate slowly, more interested for a while in stirring his mush into shapes with his spoon than in eating it, until his mother's look reminded him there was a whole morning of work yet ahead and no time for play at table, at which he straightened and applied himself properly. Liesel ate quickly and neatly, already thinking ahead. Margaret could tell to her chores, for the girl had a way of eating with her eyes somewhere else entirely, running some list in her head the way her mother did. Wilhelm ate the most and fastest. A boy of 13 with a boy's appetite, sharpened further by an hour in the cold barn, and when his bowl was empty, he looked toward the stove as if considering whether more might be had, until his father's raised eyebrow reminded him that the mush was meant to stretch to noon dinner as well as breakfast, and there would be cornbread and beans enough at midday to see him through. Outside, by the time the meal was cleared, the sun had cleared the flat edge of the land at last, not with any great ceremony, but simply arriving, a low red disk burning through the haze of ice crystals that hung in the air on the coldest mornings, throwing long blue shadows west from the barn and the corn crib and the windmill's skeleton frame, its wheel turning slow and complaining in the wind, though the well beneath it would want a fire built under the pump housing before it worked freely again, the groundwater having crept part way to freezing in the pipe overnight. Johann went out to see to that himself, laying a small fire of corn cobs in the little tin housing built around the pump's base for exactly this purpose, waiting by it with his hands in his armpits until he heard the mechanism give and knew the water would draw again. Margaret, meanwhile, had turned the kitchen over to its daytime purposes. The breakfast dishes went into the basin with water heated on the stove, and while they soaked, she set Liesel to the day's first task, which was carding a basket of wool sheared back in the autumn from the 4 sheep they kept mostly for that purpose, wool that would in the weeks ahead become mittens and stockings for the whole family, worked at in the evenings by lamplight. Liesel took to the carding paddles at the table, drawing the wool between their wire teeth in long, even strokes, the fibers straightening and lightening under her hands until they lay like combed hair, soft and pale as unbleached muslin, releasing as she worked a faint sheep smell, lanolin sweet, not unpleasant, that mixed in the warm kitchen air with the smell of drying dishes and the last of the wood smoke curling from the stove's damper. Franz was given his own small task, that of sorting the dried apple rings from a burlap sack into 2 crocks, the good ones for pie and the smaller broken pieces for a sauce, a job invented mostly to keep his hands busy and his mind content, though he took to it with real seriousness, holding each ring up to the window light as though inspecting it for some flaw only he could detect, before dropping it with a small satisfied clink into whichever crock he judged it belonged. By the window, where the light was best, Margaret set out the McGuffey readers, worn soft at the corners from 3 years of use, first Wilhelm's, and now handed down part way to Liesel, who was working through the 2nd book while her brother had gone on to the 4th. There was no school today. The schoolhouse 2 miles off would not open its door again until the roads packed down harder, the schoolmaster having sent word round by a neighbor that he judged the drifts along the section line too deep, yet for the youngest children to walk safely, and so lessons at home would have to serve, as they often did in the deepest weeks of winter. Wilhelm read aloud a passage while he waited for his father to call him back out to the woodpile, his finger moving under the words, though he scarcely needed it any more, his voice steady and a little proud in the reading, for he liked being asked to read to his mother while she worked, liked the sound of his own voice filling the warm room. Margaret listened with half her attention, the other half on the darning egg and the sock stretched over it, the wool needle moving in and out along a worn heel with the same unhurried rhythm as her son's reading, weaving new thread into old, the way she had woven whole seasons of mornings just like this one into the fabric of the life she had built here. Not the life she had once imagined for herself in Hanover, sitting at her mother's polished table with its lace cloth and its silver, but a life she had come, slowly and without quite noticing the exact turning point, to want more than that other one. There was a satisfaction in the darning, in watching a worn place become whole again under her own hand, that she had never once felt sitting idle in her mother's parlor, and she had stopped, some years back now, feeling the comparison as a loss. "Read that line again," she said to Wilhelm, not because she had missed it, but because she liked the sound of it twice. And he obliged without complaint, his voice carrying the old lesson about the industrious ant and the idle grasshopper out into the warm, close air of the kitchen, mixing there with the scratch of the carding paddles and the small click of dried apple rings falling into crockery, and the low, steady tick of the stove settling as its fire burned down toward the coals it would need banking into by mid-morning. Outside, the frost had begun in the sun's low slant to bead and run a little at the very bottom edges of the window panes, the ferns losing their sharp edges there first, though the greater part of the glass would stay white and patterned the whole short day through. The sun in January never climbing high enough or staying long enough to do more than soften the very margins of the cold. Margaret could hear, faint and rhythmic through the wall, the sound of Johann's axe finding the chopping block in the yard, splitting the cottonwood rounds into stove lengths, a sound as much a part of the winter morning as the wind itself, steady, unhurried, entirely without alarm. The sound, she had come to think of it, of a household simply going on, day folded into day, each one very much like the last, and each one, in its plain and unremarkable way, entirely enough. Dinner, the day's main meal, came at noon by the mantel clock Johann had carried west, wrapped in 3 layers of wool inside his trunk, and it was Margaret's habit to have it ready and waiting when the men came in from whatever the morning's outside work had been, for a body chilled through wanted feeding quickly before the cold could settle too deep to shake. Today, it was beans that had simmered since before dawn in the back of the stove, thick with a knuckle of salt pork and the canned tomatoes brought up from the cellar, and a pan of cornbread baked golden and split open now to let the butter melt down into it, and alongside that the last of the previous day's fried potatoes, warmed again in the skillet with a little onion. Johann came in from the woodpile with his beard rimed white where his breath had frozen in it, stamping the snow from his boots on the sill before he'd step full onto the floor, a habit so old in this house that even Franz had taken it up in imitation, stamping his small boots with great seriousness, though he had been no farther than the privy path that morning. They ate with the particular hunger that only cold work brings, little talk at first beyond Johann, noting that the woodpile was in good shape now for a week at least, provided the weather held no worse than it was, and Wilhelm reporting that Prince had thrown a bit of a shoe loose, which would want Johann's attention before it worked off entirely, a small errand for the smith in town some week soon, nothing pressing. Margaret mentioned that the flour was running low enough to want thinking about before the next trip in, and that reminded Johann of the mail which he had not yet fetched from the box at the section corner, a good 3/4 of a mile off, a walk he generally saved for after dinner, when the sun had climbed to its thin best and the worst of the morning cold had eased a little. After the meal, While Margaret and Liesel cleared the table and set the beans back to keep warm for supper, Johann pulled on his coat again and took the sled rope in hand, for there was fuel yet to bring in from the stack beyond the barn. Not wood alone, which they used sparingly, being a scarcer resource on this open country than back east, but the twists of dried slough hay, and the corn cobs saved through the autumn, and the flat dried chips gathered from the pasture in warmer months, stacked now under a lean-to roof to keep them dry through the winter. It was Wilhelm's task most days to help haul this in, and the two of them went out together, father and son, the sled runners hissing over the crusted snow, and loaded it high with enough fuel to see the stove through a day and a night, for a fire that burned mixed fuel this way wanted tending often, but never wanted for want of something to burn, the plains providing, in their own plain way, exactly what a household needed if a family only knew how to gather it. Franz, bundled past all sense in his coat and 2 scarves, was allowed out with them as far as the yard, where he busied himself building a small fort of packed snow against the corner of the chicken coop, singing to himself some tuneless private song, entirely absorbed, while Liesel watched him through the window between chores, ready to call him in the moment his hands looked too red. Inside, once the fuel sled had been unloaded into the box by the stove, Margaret took down the mail-order catalog from its shelf, the thick book from the Chicago house that had come by post back in the autumn and had been thumbed through so many times since that its corners had gone soft as cloth. It was less a shopping errand than a kind of fireside entertainment on the slow winter afternoons, and she and Liesel pored over it now together at the table, the girl tracing her finger down the columns of dress goods and ribbon, exclaiming softly over an illustration of a hat she had no earthly use for, and no intention of asking after, simply liking to look. Margaret herself studied the page of garden seed with more practical interest, thinking ahead already, in the deep of January, to the plot she would put in come April, the early peas, the cabbage, the seed corn for the small kitchen patch separate from Johann's field corn, and made a note in pencil on a torn scrap to remind herself what she meant to order when the egg money had built up enough to spare it. Wilhelm, back inside now with cheeks still red from the cold, took up his father's task of splitting a portion of the smaller wood into kindling lengths at the chopping block just inside the lean-to, close enough to be out of the wind, and Johann himself went to the harness pegs in the barn to oil the leather traces against the coming cold. A slow, methodical task he liked well enough in winter, working the neat's foot oil into the stiff leather with a rag until it darkened and softened under his hands. The barn quiet around him, but for the horses shifting in their stalls, and the wind finding its way in thin whistling threads through the chinks of the sod wall, a sound he had long since stopped noticing as anything but the ordinary voice of the season. By mid-afternoon, the sun, never having climbed very high to begin with, had already begun its long, slow slide back toward the western edge of the land, the light going from thin white to a paler gold, throwing the shadow of the windmill long and blue across the yard. Margaret set Liesel to piecing quilt squares at the table while she herself took up mending one of Johann's shirts, a seam gone at the shoulder from the day's axe work, easily set right with needle and thread, and the two of them worked in a companionable quiet, broken only by the small domestic sounds of the house. The scrape of Liesel's scissors through calico, the tick of the stove, the low murmur Franz kept up to himself over by the window where he had come in at last, pink-cheeked and satisfied with his fort, now absorbed in a game of soldiers made from a handful of corn cobs, stood on end along the sill. The bread, cooled now on its rack, filled the kitchen still with its last faint, warm smell, and under it the good smell of the beans keeping on the back of the stove, and under that, fainter, the oiled leather smell that clung to Johann's hands when he came back in briefly for a drink of water, and beneath all of it the same wind, unbroken since before dawn, running its long, low note across the whole flat country outside, over the barn roof and the corn crib and the windmill's slow turning wheel, over the mile of white field between the house and the section road, over the 2 miles beyond that to the schoolhouse standing dark and empty in the drifts, and beyond that, farther still, toward town, toward the rail line, toward all the wide, unhurried distances that made up this particular corner of the world the Renkas had chosen, and which asked of them, on an afternoon like this one, nothing more than what they were already giving it: steady hands, a warm stove, and the patient, unremarkable rhythm of a day that meant, eventually, only to end in rest. The light began its true failing by 4, the gold going to a low copper along the horizon, and then to a deep blue that seemed to rise up out of the snow itself rather than fall from the sky. And with it came the hour for the evening chores, the same round as the mornings, but shorter, brisker, everyone moving now with the particular urgency of wanting to be done and back inside before full dark settled. Johann and Wilhelm went out together again, lanterns lit before they were needed, for the dusk out here came on with very little warning between enough light to see by and none at all. Bertha wanted milking a second time, the horses their evening hay and a check of their blankets, the chickens shut snug into their coop for the night, the plain, sensible habit of a farm, the same as latching a gate, and the hogs their last feeding of scraps and corn. Margaret, inside, built the fire up higher against the coming cold of night, and set the beans to their final simmer, adding a spoon more of molasses and a shake of the pepper kept dear in its little tin, and set Liesel to slicing what remained of the morning's bread, while she herself worked the last of the fried potatoes into a pan with a fresh bit of salt pork. The kitchen filling now with a good, thick supper smell that pressed pleasantly against the cold pressing in from the walls. Franz had been allowed the job of laying the table again, a chore he took to with the gravity of a much older child, setting each fork with exaggerated care, and when he had finished, he stood back to admire it before climbing onto the bench to wait, swinging his legs, humming his tuneless song again under his breath. The men came in stamping and blowing on their hands, the cold riding in with them in a wave that the warm room absorbed and dispelled within a minute or two. Johann setting the full milk pail on the sideboard and rubbing Franz's head in passing, drawing a delighted squeal from the boy at the touch of his father's cold fingers against his warm scalp. They ate supper by lamplight now in earnest, the kerosene lamp's flame steady behind its chimney, throwing soft, moving shadows up the log and plaster walls, the window, gone entirely black and reflective, showing back at them their own table, their own faces in place of whatever lay beyond the glass in the dark yard. Talk at supper ran easier than it had at dinner, the day's work behind them now, nothing left to plan but the evening. Wilhelm asked his father about the shoe on Prince's hoof, whether they might ride into the smith Saturday next, if the weather stayed fair, and Johann allowed that they might, and asked in turn whether Wilhelm thought he was ready yet to try his hand at the shoeing himself under the smith's watching eye, a suggestion that lit the boy's face with a pride he tried and failed to keep from showing outright. Liesel told of a hen that had taken to roosting in the hayloft rather than the coop, a small domestic mystery that occupied the table for a full minute of speculation, Franz offering the theory, delivered with total confidence, that the hen simply preferred a better view, which made his mother laugh outright and reach over to smooth his hair. When the plates were cleared and washed in the basin, the lamp was moved to the center of the table, and the evening properly began. That long, unhurried stretch between supper and sleep that the family had come over their years on this land to treat as its own small reward for the day's labor. Margaret brought out her mending basket again and the sock she had left half finished that morning, while Johann took down the ledger book in which he kept his account of the farm. Seed bought, eggs sold, the small sums that passed between the homestead and the town, and worked over it slowly with a stub of pencil, more from long habit than urgent need, the figures for January being simple enough this deep in winter, when so little moved on or off the place beyond eggs and cream and the occasional trip for flour or coal oil. Wilhelm read on from his MacGuffey by the lamp's edge, his lips moving faintly over the harder words, and Liesel took up the quilt square she cut earlier, working small even stitches along its border with a concentration that pulled her tongue faintly between her teeth, a habit her mother had never managed to break her of and had, in truth, stopped trying to. Franz grew drowsy early, as he always did, curling at last against his mother's side on the bench with his thumb creeping toward his mouth despite himself, his eyes fighting the lamp's low, steady light and losing by slow degrees. Outside, the wind had not slackened at all with the coming of full dark. If anything, it seemed to gather itself in the deeper cold, running its same long, unbroken note along the eaves and around the corners of the house, rattling faintly at the stovepipe where it passed through the roof, a sound so constant and so familiar to every soul in that room that none of them so much as lifted their heads to it any more than a sailor lifts his head to the sound of the sea. It was simply the sound the night made out here, the sound that had accompanied every evening of the Reinke's life on this claim, since the first sod had been broken for the first crude soddy they'd raised the year they arrived, and which accompanied them still now in this better house, framed and clapboarded, that Johann had built plank by plank across 4 patient summers, as the farm found its feet beneath them. The lamp burned low and cold over the table, over the bent heads at their several tasks, over the dark window that held nothing now but their own reflected warmth thrown back at them from the glass, and the stove ticked and settled behind them, fed once more before full evening set in, and now beginning, by slow degrees, the long steady burn that would carry its warmth through the room for hours yet to come, long past the time when the lamp itself would be trimmed down and carried up to light the children to their beds. Franz was carried up first, already gone fully to sleep against his mother's shoulder, his weight warm and total in the way that only a sleeping child's weight is, and Margaret climbed the ladder, rungs slowly with him, one arm hooked through the rail, and laid him into the low cot tucked under the loft slope, drawing the quilt to his chin and smoothing back the hair from his forehead a moment before she turned away, the small ritual she performed every night of his life, without ever once finding it tiresome. Liesel came up after on her own feet, yawning behind her hand, and burrowed into her own cot with the quilt pulled high, murmuring a sleepy good night that was answered in kind. Wilhelm stayed below a little longer, permitted the privilege of his age, finishing the page of his reader by the lamp before he too climbed up, moving quietly now so as not to wake the others, settling into his own corner of the loft with the particular contented stiffness of a body that has done a full day's honest work and is glad at last to be still. Below, Margaret and Johann made their own last rounds of the house, the small, unhurried tasks that closed every night the same way they had closed every night for years. Johann banked the stove for its long burn, raking the coals into a bed at the center and settling a fresh cob and a larger stick of wood atop them, then closing the damper down to a narrow breadth, enough to keep a live coal through till morning without burning the fuel away too fast, a skill he had learned slowly and by trial across a dozen winters, until he could judge it now, almost without looking, by the color of the coals alone. Margaret checked the latch on the door, drew the curtain of heavy ticking cloth across the window nearest the beds to cut the worst of the draught, and set the water pail a little closer to the stove's warmth, so it would not freeze solid by dawn. The lamp was trimmed low, its flame narrowing to a small steady bead of gold, and carried to the small table beside the bed downstairs, where Johann and Margaret slept. The room's own separate small space curtained off from the main room by a hung quilt, modest but sufficient. They undressed quickly in the cold down to their nightclothes, and climbed beneath the heavy layers of quilt and comforter, the feather bed beneath them, holding what little warmth their bodies made and returning it twofold, the way it always did once a body had lain still in it a few minutes. Margaret drew her shawl still closer about her shoulders atop the nightgown, an old habit from colder nights than this one, and Johann reached over at last and turned the small wheel on the lamp until the flame guttered and drew down to nothing, the room going dark all at once but for the faint orange seam of light escaping the stove's damper across the room, a low, steady eye of warmth watching over the sleeping house. For a while neither of them spoke, only lay listening to the house settle around them the way it always did at this hour, the stove ticking as the iron cooled by degrees, a small shift and creak from the loft above as one of the children turned in sleep, and under it all unbroken, the same wind that had run along the eaves since before dawn, still running now, no louder and no softer than it had been at any hour of this long, unremarkable day, simply the sound the plains made in January, the sound this house had been built to stand against and had stood against, comfortably enough for a dozen winters now, and looked, in its plain, sturdy way, fit to stand against a dozen more. Warm enough? Johann murmured, the same question he asked most nights, not because he doubted the answer, but because he liked to hear it. Warm enough, Margaret answered, and drew a little closer to the solid warmth of him under the quilts, and let her eyes close. Somewhere above them, Franz murmured something in his sleep, wordless and contented, and was still again. The coals ticked once more behind the damper and settled into their long, slow burn. The wind went on outside, patient and unhurried, wearing its same old path around the corners of the house and out across the sleeping white miles of the claim, past the dark shape of the barn where the animals stood warm in their own close breath, out over the section road and the schoolhouse and all the wide, quiet country beyond, while inside, at last, the whole small household lay still beneath its quilts, breath slowing, limbs loosening one by one, and then all together sinking down into the deep, unbroken sleep that the day's long plain labor had earned them, and that the night, dark and cold and steady outside the walls, now settled gently over the house to keep